Welcome, everybody, back to the Happy Cynics. And here's Dr. K and iDog with you. And today we're going to delve into a topic that at the surface level seems pretty obvious, but we want to kind of push beneath the surface a bit and talk about diversity. In what ways is diversity important? So let me open it up to you first, Isaac. What do you think, what do you consider the benefits of diversity? Like, why do we even make this an issue?
Yeah, well, I think this is I can hear the alarm bells going off in our audience's heads that two white guys with a podcast are going to talk about diversity. But I assure you, we're purely coming at this from a place of curiosity. And I think diversity is such an interesting topic because it's so broad. So I think it's important that we be specific when we're talking about like the types of diversity we're talking about.
Okay, so you want to specify that? And let me say this. Okay, in piggybacking off of what Isaac just said, yeah, why not, though, two white guys who want to hear the opinions of other people? All right, so we're championing and speaking up for diversity, but again, with the premise of this show, the notion is that sometimes people assume that diversity will do more than it really will. And so diversity is necessary for a lot of positive benefits, but it isn't always a sufficient cause by itself. So in other words, just grabbing a diverse group of people is not necessarily going to create synergy. So that's what we want to kind of get into. How can we reap the benefits of diversity? So go ahead, Isaac. You were talking about different types of diversity.
Yeah, well, and when you initially asked me about the whether or not diversity is like, what was it good for? What's the utility of diversity?
Right.
And I find it interesting, like, I feel like a lot of times certain groups treat diversity as an end in itself.
Right.
That diversity is the goal for a certain community. And while I do think diversity has a certain, like, noble virtue to it, I do think that all of the best arguments I've ever heard for diversity are in diversity as a utility towards an end. Diversity is a tool to accomplish a goal, not an end in itself.
Okay, so let's talk about those ends. So what would you identify as some of those ends?
Well, I think having more perspectives, being exposed to more perspectives, broadens our horizons for reality. So having diverse people around us exposes us to realities that we cannot access on our own, and therefore can assist us on our journey towards discovering the truth. Right. So yes. I think diversity challenges our paradigms.
Right.
In ways that's fundamental towards really pursuing the truth. I don't think you can pursue the truth without a diversity of perspectives.
True. And so in my mind, the first thing that comes up, the image that comes up for me is Plato's allegory of the cave. And I talk about this, I don't know how many times, but for those of you who aren't familiar with this, in Plato's Republic, at one point, he talks about, imagine there's this group of people who have been chained inside of this cave for their entire lives. Now, without going into all the depth and detail, part of the issue for Plato is, would these people naturally wonder if there's an outside world beyond their cave, or does somebody from the outside have to come in and kind of introduce them to new ideas? And you can see where, let's put it this way, even if there are people that are naturally curious and want to find their way outside of the caves in which they're born, into, okay, they still have to, in other words, seek out different opinions, or they're looking to expand their models, ways of viewing the world. You can, sometimes when we talk about, this is what I find kind of interesting. When I was a little kid, there were a number of songs that kind of were hanging around from like the 1950s and 60s about how we're all part of the human family, and regardless of the difference of the color of our skin, or language we speak, or our socioeconomic background, or whatever, we're all the same underneath. We're all human beings. And that is true. Here's the thing. Diversity of some of these kind of more, I don't want to say superficial, but you can't just assume, this is like you can't judge a book by the cover. You can't just assume that by somebody's outward appearance that they're going to be operating from a different worldview or model or opinion than somebody else. And so we have to have this exposure to people who think differently than us.
Yeah, and I think when we focus on defending our own perspective and criticizing others' perspectives, that's an indicator that we value our beliefs over valuing reality.
Yes.
But when it comes to those superficial, like, categorical differences, like, are you black, white, Asian, whatever, racial differences, anything that would be considered, I would call them like identitarian,
Mm-hmm.
that concerns your like political identity, I would consider superficial, but I do think that there is a level at which they are important to be considered.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely true. When we think about diversity, and I guess I don't want to say that we are the sum, like we are the sum total of our thinking, but I do think that a lot of who we are is tied up in the way that we think. Would you agree or disagree with that premise to start with? Like, I know there's a part of me that like is, there's genetics, there's environment and this and that, but even the genetics and the way that I respond to my environment are generally reflected in my thinking. So like, I'm even thinking about, even in the Gospels, Jesus said, as a person, as we think in our hearts, that's what we are. Like, and like from out of the inside come the things that defile the person or make the person virtuous. And so I really do. I tend to be leaning towards what we call cognitivism, where the way we process our information and our experiences and form those into beliefs, that, in my opinion, is a large part of our identity. And that's why I think, like, when you have something like Alzheimer's, some other kind of dementia, it just gradually erodes away at somebody's identity. Like, they still have an identity, but it becomes more and more generic.
Yeah, I would push back against that a little bit, but I don't know if we want to really get into that for this episode. This would be so I'll just.
Well, I'm going to at least frame it. I'm going to at
brief-
least frame that so that we are aware of that when we start talking about diversity and say, like, getting benefit from other people's opinions and experiences. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and I think my pushback against cognitivism is essentially my argument for why identity matters. Like, for, say, an oppressed minority, their identity is less in their thoughts and more in their political entity, right? Because they don't get to separate themselves from, let's say, their skin color, by like escaping to the mind, because that's how the state treats them, or that's how society has oppressed them. So for oppressed identities, I do think that there's less of a cognitive element, simply because they are treated not according to their internal person, but because they're treated as their external person.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an element of privilege in being able to separate from your political being in that way. But that's not necessarily the argument I would make for identity in diversity.
Okay.
So what I would argue is that our identity, let's say our racial identity, forms the raw material of experience that we use to create our individual identities, in which we can have diversity of thought. So there is racial perspective, and there are individual perspectives within a racial perspective, but they are all working on similar material that comes from their external identity.
Right.
And I'm not like, I'm also not married to this take.
Okay. All right.
But it is something that I've like been thinking about.
Because I'm still not dissuaded from the cognitivism, because I would kind of frame it, what you're describing, and right or wrong, and I think we're just maybe talking past each other. But let's put it this way: there's a part of my thoughts, I'll just speak about myself. Okay, there's a part of each one of us, I think, where most of what we think comes from like group thinking. Like we learn from parents and others, peers and other people as we grow up, and we incorporate that. All becomes a part of like my thinking and my identity. So even when we're talking about, okay, so let's say the child that's adopted. Okay. The child that's adopted is maybe at some level has some kind of, feels some sort of tie to biological parents that they've never met. But yet, probably a good part of that child's identity is going to be wrapped up in the group and environment in which they were raised. And I still would view that as like a type of like being still like a composition, a compilation of the person's thoughts and beliefs. I think, like, even to the extent that we identify with different groups of people, let's say even politics, a political party, all right? I would venture say the vast majority of people say, well, I agree with the party platform on this issue and this issue, but not necessarily on this one or this one or this one. So there's this kind of mixture of both my individual interpretations versus the interpretations that the group decides to share together. All right. So even when we're talking about diversity, you're not just talking about introducing individuals to other individuals. You're also talking about the need to introduce groups to other groups. Okay. So, and this is what a lot of people don't get. So, okay. So as in my experience in higher education, say it this way, there's a difference between, we're diverse because we have people with this characteristic and that characteristic and that characteristic. But when you talk about, does our group interact with other groups of people? Okay, then that's not really what I would call a robust type of diversity. It's somewhat superficial, especially if the central group kind of filters out. Like, so we'll let people in who don't like fit the mold per se, but it's not like we're going to invite in groups of people to take their perspectives into account.
That's interesting, because one of the main questions that I had coming into this was, like, at what point is diversity inevitable? Because every individual comes with their own perspective, regardless of the overlap. Right? Like, you were talking about like a party platform.
Right.
Like, everybody has differences with their party platform. But if everybody in the room is a Republican, is it diverse? At what point does diversity begin? And at what point is it separate from individual perspectives being different?
Well, see, now we're, I think you're exactly right, but then that circles us right back to the thing that Plato was couldn't decide. He was trying to figure out. Are people naturally going to break free of their groups or wander out of their caves to look for something else? Or will they seek out like-minded people? I mean, we talked about this earlier, several weeks ago, maybe even back in our first episode. I would have thought, like, I came from, like I said, a more rural area of the country. And there was, because even of geography and such, there was to a certain extent, the area that I was growing up was somewhat isolated from other areas, just as a lot of rural settings are. Okay. And even like within cities, sometimes you'll even have entire neighborhoods that are kind of isolated from the rest of the city. Okay. Here's the thing. Will people, when they get exposed to other ideas, are they going to actually listen to those? See, and I don't know that diversity is necessarily inevitable. I mean, I think that everybody's awareness that there is diversity is inevitable, but whether people will actually interact with others or just kind of revert to tribalism, I'm not sure about that.
Well, the question is diversity just inherent in groups of individuals, right? Because individuals have their own perspective.
Well, that's true.
And at what point do we
Yes.
At what point do we say, like, well, all individuals are unique perspectives, but there has to be, like, at what level is there a categorical difference between persons that constitutes diversity?
I agree with that.
So there has to be like a threshold that we're meeting in order to call this diversity, and not just, oh, this is a group of people who disagree.
Yes. And the other thing that comes about here is you could take a diverse group of people and put them together in a group, and they can even interact with one another, but it's not necessarily going to broaden anybody's perspective or generate any creativity or any kind of synergy unless there are certain other elements in place. Like, for example, there has to be some kind of practical relevance or utility in listening to the other person's opinion. So, in other words, you could take a diverse group of people, but let's say, the United States Olympic Committee wants to listen to diverse opinions, but suppose the people that they include don't really know anything about athletics or the nature of amateur or professional athletics. Well, I'm not sure that, you can see there's going to be, it kind of comes back to like some type of like a Laffer curve where you get to a point where it can be maximized, and then beyond that, it just kind of starts falling off in its utility. And it's just the same thing is true, like even in like group discussions. Okay. You can have, if you end up having too much diversity within a group, you can have people that share very few. I mean, it would still have the benefit, but it would take much longer for folks to come to some kind of rationale where they're going to be able to benefit from each other's ideas. So I guess what I want to say is, it seems to me that we best learn from people who in some ways think like us, but in other ways think differently than us. If you have somebody that thinks differently from you in every single way, unless you are just an extremely curious soul, I don't know what's going to make the average person going to want to even talk to that person, as opposed to just writing that person off as being weird or different.
Well, I think what you said earlier about having groups interact with other groups is a very interesting and I think potentially fruitful avenue to discuss, like how you would go about utilizing diverse opinions. So in my experience, most of the diversity that I have experienced in my life, I have experienced as a minority in a group, right? So getting out of, so I'm a white middle class dude, getting into black middle class circles was a diverse experience for me, although not necessarily for them as a group. You know, just because they had one white dude hanging out with them, it doesn't make that a diverse opinion,
right.
experience. But I glean a lot from it because I'm not in my, normal racial group, so I can learn things as an individual out of place. And almost all of my experiences where I have been out of my comfort zone or in a place where I'm a minority have been very educational and eye-opening for me. So I wonder about, like, if we're just talking about how do we utilize diversity well, I wonder if there's a way to do it beyond just, well, I'm an individual kind of fish out of water experience.
Yes.
But this experience is extremely valuable to me.
Yes.
So, and I guess I'll illustrate with a story. When I back during the pandemic, not that the pandemic is over, but back when the pandemic was a new thing,
right?
I got hired by the 2020 census to go door to door and be an enumerator in a fairly segregated town, small city in the Midwest. That wasn't like segregated racially, but very segregated in terms of like wealthy versus poor. And I was primarily assigned to extreme poverty, like the neighborhoods that people who have to dress professionally probably wouldn't feel super comfortable in, and you have to dress professionally as a census enumerator. So that was a very diverse experience for me because I got to interact with people that I had lived in this small city for a long time, never interacted with these people, never been in these neighborhoods.
So you were the guy. You were the guy with
was,
the pinstripe suit wearing the do-rag or something.
No, I wasn't.
Like
I wasn't quite that classy, but I was. Something. I did have to wear a button-up shirt and a tie, which was unusual, and like that's kind of ritzy for these areas. And I mean, we're talking about parts of town that like people had dirt floors, like very poor,
right?
And overwhelmingly, my experience was positive. People were welcoming. People wanted to help. Like it was an overwhelmingly positive experience.
That's outstanding.
except for the few times that I had my life threatened.
Oh.
So it was like either like extremely good or extremely bad, but both experiences were very insightful into like my own prejudices as an individual, and also the types of pressures that these communities face. I mean, I could go on and on about all the things I learned from interacting with all these different, generally poor, sometimes extremely wealthy people as I worked this job. But I experienced all those things as an individual.
No, that's true, but you still bring a group identity with you.
Yeah, but I don't think that those people that I was interacting with, who were like, were getting anything out of my perspective. I was mostly benefiting from their perspective.
Well, that's true. That's true.
And that's what I mean by like, that's what I'm trying to get at with like, how do we utilize diversity well, other than just like, oh, I'm an individual fish out of water.
Yes. I had, I'll tell you what, in my first year of seminary, we lived in Jackson, Mississippi. And I would assume that the demographics are still similar. I think at the time we lived there in the early 90s, I think Jackson was somewhere about 80 to 90% Black, okay, inside the city. And we lived inside the city. And the vast majority of our neighbors were people of color. And I just thoroughly enjoyed the experience. And I worked at one of the hospitals, kind of overseeing a waiting room for intensive care and coronary care, and got to interact with a lot of families. And it was a phenomenal experience. I came from white bread America, and I'll tell you, it was an eye-opening thing to be like the only white person in the grocery store. And it wasn't because I felt awkward, but it's just like I realized then how people of color felt like in my context that I grew up in. And it's nothing against the people of where I grew up. I mean, I didn't have experiences of people with just kind of antipathy or hatred towards others, but it's just that people just kind of stayed in their own corners and didn't interact. And that's unfortunate. I guess what I'm kind of referring to here, there's a lot of places out there, especially in academia, who talk about diversity. But I really wonder how much these alternative perspectives are being gleaned from in the classroom or in discussions on campus and such. For example, like it's one thing, like let's say go back to my years as a minister, parish pastor. Okay. It's one thing to welcome anybody, regardless of what they look like and where they come from and what their social status is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like America being the big melting pot. Okay. Well, it's one thing to say, well, we welcome in anybody, but the underlying premise is that you will change to fit our mold, and then we'll accept you. That's not really diversity. I mean, that is what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a mixture. It's more of a how do I want to say this? I'm trying to think of like in chemistry or like cooking. So
it's like a suspension.
Yeah, a suspension instead of a solution. So like instead of there being a mixture of different ideas and different perspectives, it's just you have people that originally had different ideas and different perspectives, but then they're expected to go through this filter to fit in with everybody else. I just to me that I don't know. It seems kind of hypocritical to me, and it seems kind of demeaning to people. I would think it would be demeaning to people who want to feel like, you're a person who ticks off some sort of, checklist, checks a box for them.
Yeah, well, that actually segues almost perfectly into my little categories of diversity thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when thinking about this, I kind of came up with two different approaches to diversity that I think can serve as like framing devices for how we talk about it. So there's exclusive diversity and inclusive diversity. And it's a little counterintuitive, I think, how they work, but exclusive diversity lists desired identities and dimensions of diversity.
Okay, say that again. Say that again.
So exclusive diversity lists desired identities and dimensions of diversity.
Okay, so it wants different things, but not necessarily trying to mix them together.
Well, it does want to mix them together. All diversity has to mix, but the primary thing is like, oh, well, we're forming a board of directors and we want a black person, a woman, somebody from the LGBTQIA community. Like, it lists the things that it desires.
Okay.
In terms of dimensions of diversity.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead and do and keep going.
Yeah, so it'll clarify when I contrast.
Yes, go ahead.
So inclusive diversity lists undesired identities and dimensions of diversity.
Oh.
So inclusive diversity would say, well, everyone is welcome, but we don't want flat earthers, say.
Right.
Right. So it's inclusive of everything except what it deems unethical, would be my take.
Oh, okay.
So those are the two different approaches. So exclusive is like, if you fit into these identitarian categories, then you count towards diversity. That's exclusive diversity. Right?
Okay.
So we need somebody of a different race. We need somebody of a different gender. We need somebody of a different sexuality. We need somebody of yada, yada, yada.
Oh.
And then we're diverse. Whereas inclusive diversity says, well, we don't want Nazis. And we don't want people who are hateful, and we don't want people who are conspiracy theorists, or we don't want people who, any dimension there.
Okay.
And because we don't want those things, we're accepting of everything else.
Okay, so I'm not so clear on why the terms are being used that way and not flip-flopped. Because it would seem to me that if you're going to say, okay, well, inclusive is, these are all the things we want to include. Exclusive would seem to me to say, these are the things that we want to exclude.
My thought was that exclusive diversity, the way I've named them.
Okay.
Exclusive is exclusive because you have to belong to one of the categories that counts for diversity. And inclusive is there are no categories we're looking for. All categories are welcome.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So exclusive in the sense of differentiating.
Yeah, exclusive is what I would call like Hollywood diversity.
Okay.
All
right. So
we've ticked all the boxes.
We want to have so many different colors in this painting.
Right, and when you said like, oh, well, we're ticking the boxes of diversity.
Yes.
That to me is exclusive diversity. Like, we want these diverse identities, but we don't want diverse opinions.
Okay. So,
like everybody, what's
the difference in the
Hollywood,
functionality?
For instance.
What's the difference in the functionality between these two? Am I putting you on the spot here too much?
So, no, I don't. I just want to think through what I'm going to say, so I might need a second here.
All right.
To me, exclusive diversity, or like, I think it's easier to understand it as like corporate diversity.
Okay. Right.
Is purely performative. And, okay, so in a Hollywood production, you can say, oh, well, we've got all these different racial groups, all these different sexualities, all these things, and they're all millionaires.
Right.
And God forbid poor people have anything to say about this.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So it's exclusive of that perspective.
Okay. All right.
Whereas inclusive diversity, or what I would probably call like grassroots diversity, is more like, well, we cannot tolerate certain things.
Right.
However, as long as you're not, A, B, or C, you are welcome, and we will incorporate and change and adapt for you. Right. So in that way, it's inclusive. That's why I would name it inclusive, except for, like, to my mind, it would be like, and different groups would obviously draw this a different way, but in my ideal version of this, you would draw those lines along ethical lines. So ethics would be the guiding force for how we go about incorporating diversity. So yeah, we can have all these diverse opinions, and we should consider them equally, but we don't have to consider Nazis' opinions.
Right.
Like, we don't have to consider fascism. We can just write it off because it's on an ethical ground. We can just say this is baseless.
Yes. Yeah.
And that
there are a lot of people that would just like to not that either of us are supporting any of these ideologies, but it doesn't accomplish anything to just forbid. It's just like, him whose name which can't be spoken, Voldemort or whatever his name was on Harry Potter. It's like, oh no, you can't talk about that. Like, would it not be better to have people show the fallaciousness of that type of thinking and to basically debate it down? At least you're listening to these opinions. See, and this is kind of what's interesting is, like, do you ever get a really serious debate show? We were talking about what was the base or the benefit of debates. So it still kind of ties back into this. So, like, do you ever really see a genuine debate where both sides listen to each other and they make points for and against, certain things, and they try to reason with one another and reason with the audience? Or it just ends up being like a lot of posturing and a lot of rhetoric? And even whenever these so-called news channels, and I mean all of them, they have a guest on, how often does somebody from a different opinion really get their opportunity to say what they think, and then them then also show the same consideration of listening to somebody argue against them? It just, most of the time, it ends up being like a bunch of leading questions or people getting shouted down whenever somebody says something they don't like, and there's not really any reasoning going on. Maybe we don't trust the average person to be able to, is that what we're saying? We don't trust the average person to understand the reasoning or be able to follow arguments of why one perspective would be better than another? Why else would you shout down like certain opinions and not allow them to even be spoken? Like, to me, that just indicates a position of weakness. And I experience this on both ends of the political spectrum. Because in conservative circles, there are certain things that you're not allowed to bring up or question. And in liberal circles, there are certain things you're not allowed to question or bring up. It seems to me, the same fault. But I guess maybe that would be my question, and where I'm kind of heading in this discussion is, why do we end up with so much like diverse? Here's the thing. I think people want to appear to embrace diversity without actually embracing diversity. What I mean is, we want to appear to other people that we're considering all these perspectives and we're open to hearing different ideas. But in reality, that's not the case. We just welcome in people with certain outward characteristics to give that appearance. But when on the inside, when the way things are run and the way things are decided or discussed, certain voices and certain opinions are never heard. I don't know if you have, and maybe it's just because I'm older. Maybe.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the hearing of other opinions, I don't know if there is a way to not silence anybody. I think the difference is, like, for me, like, corporate diversity is what you're saying. Like, we're just diverse on appearance here, and we're going to say, oh, well, we're open to everybody's perspective. But because of that, I think that's like a subconscious lie of the group, that they really are silencing different perspectives, but they're doing so underhandedly. Whereas I think that, like, more grassroots diversity tends to be a little more honest about who they're not going to listen to.
Well, I think that's true. I think that's true.
And I think that there's nothing wrong with considering, like, all perspectives until certain perspectives become so intolerant that argument is no longer, like, their goal. They answer argument with violence.
So, like,
so there's a limit to this.
Yeah. So if I'm advocating dialogue, well, then how do you dialogue with somebody who's arguing against having dialogue?
Right. You just don't.
Right.
So, I mean, that goes to cite the source here. We're talking Karl Popper, The Paradox of Intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
Or The Paradox of Tolerance, whatever it's called. That'll be in the show notes for those of you who want to go read further about that. But it's essentially what we're talking about is, it's good to debate intolerant perspectives until they no longer are open to debate.
Well, true. That's exactly right. Yeah, and
at that point, I would call it like ethical exile from the diverse group. Like, we can have all these perspectives, and as long as they're not intolerant, they're welcomed, and we should invite them to change us personally. However, the minute that they become intolerant and violent, they go into ethical exile, as in, like, you're just not considered here. You cannot be here. So that kind of brings us to, I think, another interesting aspect of this, which is the tendency of communities to segregate.
Mm-hmm.
That, I mean, you can see this all throughout history, but, like, even after the Civil Rights Movement and during the Civil Rights Movement, when there was this push to integrate schools, integration since then has been on the decline, not the incline.
Right.
That neighborhoods have, and this is caused by a whole lot of things, but schools tend to be just as segregated as they ever were. And, so we're in the Chicagoland area. Chicago is one of the most diverse cities in America, but it is also one of the most segregated. Like, if you look at racial maps of Chicago, they don't mix very much.
Right.
Like, there's not a lot of integration in terms of, like, racial communities. And that's just, like, one dimension of diversity, but I think it is an indication that, like, humans tend to self-select for homogenous groups.
Mm-hmm.
Why? It would be the question. And is that bad? Is another, like, if diversity is a good thing and it exposes us to broader, horizons of reality, is it bad to silo into homogenous communities? And obviously there's like a social justice element to that when it comes to like racial and class issues, but that's not, I think, relevant to what we're talking about here.
Okay. I do think it's relevant in this sense because a question I would have in general, is it the case that what is really needed is tolerance, and diversity becomes an easier thing to pursue as opposed to promoting tolerance? And I say that because at a certain level, everybody is not going to agree. Okay, you can bring different people from different backgrounds and different groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can say, okay, how should elections be done? What should public money be spent on? And people are going to have different opinions. People may even want to live different lifestyles. Okay. And so people may prefer to segregate in groups and be around people that think like them and share their values at such and such and such. And in a free society, people should have the right and freedom to do that. But here's the thing. That in and of itself is not a problem as long as individuals can be tolerant of other individuals and groups can be tolerant of other groups. I'm not saying diversity isn't important, but diversity without tolerance, I don't know if that really gets you a whole lot. Like trying to force diversity into an intolerant group could actually be detrimental in certain ways. And I'm not saying that it should not be addressed. And sometimes, though, it can be the case that just exposure to other ideas and other people will actually make us more tolerant. That's the way it worked in my own life. I think I've mentioned this before. It wasn't so much what I learned out of books or from professors or whatever that expanded my thinking the most. What expanded my thinking the most was living among people who didn't share all the same presuppositions and paradigms that I was operating with. And it started shattering some of these stereotypes that I had.
I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with, like, is there a way to utilize diversity outside of just taking an individual and putting them in an uncomfortable situation?
Right.
Getting them out of, and not, I don't mean like uncomfortable, like, oh, I'm fearful here, but like in a in out of their comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, when you're talking about like forcing diversity as like a dangerous thing, potentially, it's when you're taking an individual and forcing them to expose their differences to the group rather than allowing the group to point out their differences to the individual.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, say it again, just to make sure it's clear.
Yeah,
to
so
all of us.
I think a lot of like corporate diversity is, on our board of directors, we're going to have individuals that represent different groups, and they're going to bring their diverse opinion to our homogenous group, and that's going to be the value they bring. And I think that is a dangerous way to go about it, because in all of the positive experiences of diversity that I've had, I have been the individual allowing the group that I don't belong to influence me rather than having the individual influence the group.
Yes. And it is, I think, pretty short-sighted to think that you're just going to select a couple group members and that's going to give you the perspective of the entire group. It's like,
right.
Did I tell you? Okay, so when this is kind of funny, but okay, so when I was in Jackson, Mississippi, okay, I worked at for a denomination known as Church of God. They're headquartered in Anderson, Indiana. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, but I was a youth pastor at one of their churches. Well, they had, I don't know, maybe six or seven churches in Jackson, Mississippi, and they would once or twice a year have like a joint service. Well, back in my younger days, I had started college as a music major. I was pretty skilled trumpet player. Well, I ended up getting through because of my senior pastor who heard me play and knew about my musical abilities and that. Well, I ended up getting recommended, like there was an intercultural, international church. It was mostly black, but they had, a lot of different nationalities in that congregation. They had like celebrating Internationalism Day kind of a thing. And they had a big musical program on a Sunday afternoon. I was invited to represent all Caucasians by playing my trumpet. So for one brief moment, I represented the Caucasian race. But it was a fun.
Good to know that
it was a fun experience.
Good to know that the white delegation is putting their best foot forward.
I was a lot younger then, but it was a great experience. But again, it's like you can't just take individuals. Like there's a difference between you interact with individuals as individuals, and you interact with groups as groups. And even groups that have representatives, the representatives don't always, adequately represent the group. Okay, it's just like, okay, so to what extent does Jesse Jackson represent black people today, or Al Sharpton, or whoever, or to what extent does Joe Biden represent Democrats or whatever? It all depends. Whatever group you're talking about, to what extent does Trump represent Republicans? It ends up being a little more complex than that. And so I guess the thing I want to say is there's a sense where I think people are satisfied with some kind of like a surface level diversity. But can we challenge ourselves to actually embrace diversity at a deeper level? And that doesn't necessarily mean that every group of people need to know everything there is possibly to know about other people. It's not really necessary for different groups of people, different ethnic groups in this country to know like how to fix, like, let's see, what's the name? They have what's it, Kashmir Pulaski Day here in Illinois. Okay, so that was all new to me when we moved out here. But it's not necessarily a thing that just because they're celebrating it, I need to understand how or know how to fix all kinds of Polish food dishes or whatever. Although I do enjoy them, but the bottom line really has to do with how much do I know about my neighbors as far as us sharing common space in a community. See, that's really what it comes down to. So you talked about Chicago, okay? Every group wants to do its own thing to a great extent. That's fine as long as they all know each other well enough that when it comes to things that affect Chicago as a whole, they're actually considering each other's perspectives. That's where diversity really becomes important. It's just like any person that we want to have any kind of relationship with. It really has to do with what part of our lives do we share with that person. Okay. So like, let's say, for example, I had a couple golfing friends and we went golfing every week or two. Well, the diversity of that may not even have to extend beyond more than just knowing, like agreeing how we're going to conduct ourselves on the golf course. Let's say one member of the foursome wants to just bring a 6-pack and drink himself half drunk, and I don't want to do that. Well, see, this is where then diversity kicks in, and then you find some kind of common ground that you can both be satisfied with. But in terms of what we're doing, the rest, like if we're not best friends and we're just golfing friends, well, then we only need to really engage in that level so that we can enjoyably and peaceably participate in golf together. And I think the same thing's true in society. It just kind of, I don't know, it kind of rubs me the wrong way whenever you see groups of people that they don't really have any intention of changing anything that they're doing for anybody else, but they want to appear to the public like they are. And so diversity this kind of surface level diversity just becomes kind of like a covering that you put over it to kind of hide what's underneath. That underneath, it's being run just as one-sided as it has always been run.
Right. And I want to kind of come back to the idea that we started with about what is the utility of diversity. Because I think this really does touch on something that this is like fundamental to our goals here at the Happy Cynics, which is exposing ourselves to diverse perspectives gets us closer to truth, and truth seeking is pretty fundamental to what we're doing here. So there is a level at which I don't think, it's good to be aware that diversity gets used as a cover for oppression frequently, especially like the corporate style diversity. But I think it is an inherent value when it comes to how are we going to get closer to the truth. I don't know if you can do that without having diverse perspectives in your life. And I think the way you approach it is fundamental to that. So challenges to our perspective, even if they're minor, tend to be existential.
Yes.
Especially when they're very different.
Right. Right.
And I think that is at the root of why we tend to segregate.
Yes.
Is that we don't want to be challenged in those ways.
Right. We don't want to be challenged at a deeper level.
Yeah. So I think that when we approach people with diverse opinions, we can't approach them in the way that like corporate diversity does, of like, you're going to fit in with our group now.
Right.
Like, we're going to change you to be one of us.
Right. That's why
you're
we
welcome.
have
You're welcome in our circle.
Yeah, right. That's why we have
right.
orientations for schools and companies and all that. So it's like, okay, here's how you fit in. It's more than that, but that's a part of it. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's that top-down control of culture that like is like, oh, we want you here, but you need to be one of us first.
Right.
Like, or we're gonna fix you.
Right. Right.
That's not the way to approach diversity if you really want to know the truth about the world and about the shortcomings of your own perspective. You need to approach it as, I'm gonna let you change me.
Well, sometimes what passes for diversity is nothing more than proselytism.
Yeah.
We'll basically convert you over to our way of thinking. And it's not really about including other people. It's just changing the face of our group when the actual ideology and ethos of the group never changes. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think the challenge I would want to say is, how do you make a community where those challenges, that the existential challenge of diversity is welcome and the community can change?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like that, I think, is the real challenge. And I think like that would be like the golden ticket. Would be, we belong to a community that values other perspectives and takes them very seriously.
Right. And even when you listen to the other side, it's just like we talk about in communication, and we talk about in communication theory. See if you can express back what you think you're hearing. Okay? Take into consideration somebody else's experiences. Have some empathy. Diversity doesn't do any good with people that don't have any empathy. Like, can you picture life through the eyes of the other person? That's a lot of it right there. And we find out that in spite of our differences, we are all alike in some fundamental ways. I mean, and that's another part of diversity. Okay. That does serve there is another function here. And that's a sense of affirming individuals in their uniqueness. And
recognizing the common humanity.
Right. So there's
that
both
is the grounds of all diversity.
Right. Yeah. There's both this tension. So like, it's almost like a triangle. Okay. So there's like the commonality with all people. There's my affinity or background with the group. And then there's also my uniqueness as an individual. And all three of these things should be operating in tandem. And it doesn't mean that, let's put it this way, we don't have to all do things the same way. We don't all have to agree on everything. But we at least have to be tolerant enough to allow, say, the democratic process to work. And I don't just mean in a political sense. I mean, like, if people want to have a diverse workplace, then are we going to incorporate cultural values that reflect, the workers, the employees, okay, like our lunch breaks and, how raises are given out and promotions and whether jobs are posted and different things like that. It really comes down to how much is the individual valued. If the individual is only valued as a utility for the group, that's not really, like Kant said, people need to be treated as an end in and of themselves and not as a means to another end. And that's a lot of it right there. It doesn't mean that I, as an individual, have to agree with other people on everything, but I have to respect their dignity and their right to their feelings and their perspectives. And we have to get back in this culture, back to dialoguing and listening to other people. And we're not going to do it, folks. We're not going to be able to do it by just getting everything from social media and news networks. So, yes, we don't need to agree on everything, but we at least have to have enough empathy and respect for the other person to listen and want to hear their perspectives and be willing to find common ground where we need to have common ground in order to
live
in a civil society.
Be willing to
go ahead.
I think it's also important that we're willing to incorporate others' perspectives when potentially that means abandoning our own.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That there's, would you say there was like maybe a synthesis of perspectives?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where
I didn't know that we were going to get to the dialectic here, but
no, but that's exactly right. Because if somebody is not even a truth seeker, well, they're not even wanting dialogue because they already have decided what they're going to believe. They don't want to be persuaded. They don't want to consider other perspectives. And they can say all they want to about valuing truth, but you don't. If you are not willing to dialogue and not willing to listen to other perspectives and to honor those perspectives, give them due consideration, well, then you're not really a truth seeker. And you're basically a belief protector is what you are. You're not a truth seeker.
Yeah, if I can be a little bit nitpicky of my own community.
Okay.
At
chicken farmers or
potentially believe it or not a lot of diversity of perspective amongst chicken farmers. Chickens are pretty much just chickens. But at risk of offending some people, I took some classes on multiculturalism and the church. And one of the common things that gets brought up is like, well, how do you convert somebody who's from like Hinduism, who's like, well, Jesus is just one of, belongs amongst our pantheon. Like we can just incorporate Christianity into Hinduism. No problem. How do you deal with that? How do you show them that like Hinduism can't possibly be accepted by Christianity? And like, how do you address this question? And I've heard this question in more than one class from more than one person. I've heard it from people not associated with the university at all. Like I've heard it in and out of classrooms. I've heard it all over the place. This is a very key example. And I think that approach is just so backwards about like, how do we convert Hindu people to Christianity when they've already incorporated Jesus and his teachings into their own religion?
Well, see, and I don't consider, honestly, and maybe what I say will offend somebody too, I don't know, but I don't consider that education in the highest sense of the word. That's just indoctrination. And when I teach world religions, after students understand how people in other cultures, what kind of presuppositions they share about the ultimate nature of reality, whether there's a God, what that God's like, or if there's a whole bunch of gods, what the nature of divine and spirituality, what it's all about. Once you get an idea of, missionaries have to do this. Now some missionaries, they don't go over and don't listen, don't try to learn anything about the other culture or their views or whatever. But if you really care about truth, listen to what they have to say. And then you can say, okay, now what do I think about this? And if somebody then says, I still prefer my religion, I still feel more confident with that than with this other one, fine. But at least you have listened to the other person's perspective and given that person the same consideration you're wanting them to give you. Like, if you don't want to listen to that person's perspective, well, then why should they feel obligated to listen to what you have to say when you put on your spiel for your faith? John Wesley talked about this. You cannot expect other people to give you liberty of conscience that you are not willing to give to them. Fair is fair. And you have to listen to the other person's point of view, then you share your own. If you want them to give you a serious hearing, you give them a serious hearing. A lot of people don't want to do that because a lot of people are not like John Wesley. John Wesley was a person who allowed his views on Christianity and religion to be changed and informed as he got older. But most people don't do that. They decide what they want to believe when they're, 25, 30 years old. And then they stop growing at that point. They don't want to change. It's not broken, so don't fix it. So that's all I'm going to say at this point. But again, the truth is what sets us free, and it's seeking truth. That it's just arrogant to somehow think that any one of us has life and the big questions of life figured out to the extent that we don't have to listen to other perspectives. I mean, just think about how arrogant that is. That'd be like one of your children, okay, trying to tell the rest of your children that they've got mom and dad figured out. None of the rest of you really understand mom and dad like I do. And as a parent, you could see how that would be pretty arrogant for one of your children to assume that they have you figured out and the rest of your children don't really understand you properly.
Yeah, and I think you said like a lot of missionaries don't want to learn anything about the culture that they're
well, they have in the past.
Evangelizing.
I can't speak into today, but that was a big issue in the 19th century.
Just for like a clarification of language here, I think missionaries learn a lot about the cultures they go to, but they don't incorporate what they learn into their own perspective. They learn it in a way of like, well, here's how you can manipulate this society to change to how we want them to be, rather than here's what this society can teach you from its unique perspective. And I think the other thing that people don't really consider is that not all incorporation of what you've learned from others' perspectives has to be positive. You can also learn things you don't want to believe from
right.
Like, so for instance, there are religions, when I was taking world religions, there are religions out there whose fundamental premise is that God is all powerful and controls everything. And by studying those religions and how they are expressing that like foundational truth, I learned that that's not something that's really important to my own religious belief. So like, that's just one example of like, oh, you can learn things about different people and incorporate them into your own perspective without like agreeing with them.
Yes.
However, it's still important that you listen and take them seriously as somebody that you have humanity in common with.
Yes. Well, I think we've kind of massaged this topic about as far as we can without really bringing other perspectives into the discussion. We're just kind of talking philosophically here. But hey, we'd love all you listeners. We'd love to hear your feedback and your input. We appreciate your interest in this podcast and your loyalty. And we hope that these discussions are helpful to you. I know they're helpful to me, just to be able to sit down, talk through some of these issues with Isaac and just kind of reflect a bit. But yeah, I mean, we can continue to take steps to continue to build a better society and build a better world and build better lives for ourselves and our neighbors all at the same time. The main thing is to not be afraid of the person who's a little different. If we can all learn to just relax, and let our guards down and just listen to each other and then just calmly discuss things, things will be a lot better for all of us. That's the way we need to start moving. And I've got a pretty good feeling that we're already starting to move in that direction. I hope it continues, but we'd love to hear your feedback. There's other issues we could get into. We talked a little bit, but these are things maybe we can probe into a little more in future episodes. We were talking about group identity, and there's all kinds of mining that we could do there. again, we could return back to paradigm shifts and how paradigms are challenged. There's different things we could look at. But Isaac, was there any loose ends that you want to tie together here, Isaac, or you feel pretty good here? I think I'm pretty satisfied with what we've done here. Anything you want to add here?
No, I think generally we've hit the points that I felt were necessary to hit. I think potentially an episode on the dialectic and how it functions would be a good foundational, like, epistemological episode.
Yeah. All right. We'll get that on the radar. We'll get that coming up here.
So that's really all I have to add. If you'd like to reach out to us, the best way to do that is by leaving us a review. We do read and pay attention to those, so please give us a follow and a review. Otherwise, you can find us at thehappycynics@gmail.com. If you'd like to send in any questions, any episode suggestions, or you just want to get in touch, that's a good way to do that.
Well, we appreciate you folks listening in, and we look forward to sharing another hour or so with you here in another 2 weeks. But again, we do enjoy this, and we hope you enjoy it too. We'd love hearing from you. We hope you all take care and have a great day.